Welcome to the CBT Nugget series for designing and implementing your server infrastructure. I'm Chris Ward, and this nugget is all about the deployment plan. I know as a project manager that planning is one of the biggest things that you need to do on anything that you're working on, whether it's planning the family vacation or planning the development and deployment of maybe 150 virtual machines running Active Directory in a new forest and getting your server infrastructure in. Planning will help make that event a great event, especially the family vacation, because nobody likes a bad family vacation. Okay, so whether you're upgrading or whether you're going to be migrating, you need a plan. It's once was said a long time ago that if you don't plan, you plan to fail. And we don't want to do that when we're developing and implementing our server infrastructure, right? And so one of the things we're going to do is we need to analyze our existing environment, which we already talked a little bit about in a previous nugget about the MAP tool, which is the Microsoft Assessment and Planning tool. And again, just something that we need to think about. We need to plan our upgrade and migration procedure. In other words, we need a process flow that we need to follow in order for us to get from A to B. You know, it's always good on a journey to have a plan to get somewhere, and we need to make sure that we have the procedures and policies in place. Backups and restoring your environment. This is just a bullet point I'm putting. We're not going to actually look into it. We'll talk a little bit briefly in maybe another nugget about backups and using your storage and things like that and how to restore. One thing that you always want to do is remember, not only are you able to back up things, you need to be able to restore those things, and you should even practice a restoration. Hopefully in an environment, maybe do a testing environment, a pilot environment, and then go from there. And then finally, we're going to take a look at our virtualization considerations, things that we need to think about when we're using the virtualized world versus the physical world. One of the first steps that we need to look at is obviously our existing environment. If we have a network in place with Windows Server 2008 R2 or something like that, we need to know what we have. You need to know where you're at before you go to where you want to go, right? It's got to be, we got to get from A to B. It makes sense. By the way, if you're going to be taking the 70-413 exam, that's the basis for the case studies. They're going to give you a case study of Contoso.com or Adatum.com or some of those Microsoft domain names that they use, Wingtip Toys, Litware, all those kind of things. And what you're going to want to do is be able to see, this is my existing environment, and then I need to get over here to my plan. So what's number one? What is our existing environment? Use the MAP toolkit. We showed that in another nugget. You can check that out. Very cool tool. Use it. It will help you out. Also use existing documentation. True story, I was talking to a friend of mine who had been hired on at a smaller business, but they had networks and applications and servers, and the IT director that was resigning, or I'm sorry, retiring, was there, and he took him to lunch, and he says, hey, I need your documentation. And the guy literally says, oh, hold on, let me show you what it is. And he gets a napkin out and starts writing out the network. That was the documentation. What you need to be doing right now, even if you haven't done so, is start documenting. Electronically, on paper, hey, paper works real good, stick it in a file folder. You need to know your IP address ranges, your subnets, what you're utilizing, what networking equipment are you using, Cisco, Palo Alto, F5s, whatever you're doing, and you need to outline what it is that you're using and how they're connected, so that way when you go and you add new applications, when you add new server infrastructure, it makes it a lot easier because you know where you are, so you know where to go. Now, what edition are you going to use? Now, here's the thing. Most of you that are taking this series of nuggets, you're looking at an enterprise level environment, corporate environment. So we pretty much, I'm just going to skip over foundations and essential. We're looking at Server 2012 R2 standard versus Server 2012 R2. Remember, I said the big difference is going to be, remember, your Hyper-V and virtual licensing. You have unlimited with data center, where you only have 2 licenses there for the standard. So it just depends on how much licensing you're going to be utilizing in a virtual environment. Speaking of licensing, what's your licensing strategy for getting out your new Windows Server 2012 that you install? Because it does require you activate the operating system after installation. Now you can do this a couple of different ways. You can do it manually. This is where maybe you're only putting out maybe a few servers, okay? So we would say maybe anything less than, I would say 10 servers, manual, that'll work for you. But let's say you are going to be utilizing a huge amount of servers, well, that's when you're going to want to use the automatic. Now, the reason why is because, think about it, in large-scale environments, that can be really cumbersome. It can be really hard for you. So one of the ways that you can do this is to utilize something called KMS. You might want to remember that. That is the Key Management Services. It does centralized activation of multiple clients. Very cool thing. And so when you install Volume Activation Services, you can then configure Active Directory-based activation, which means that anytime a computer joins the domain and you're using the Volume Activation Services, each activated computer will then go over here and contact the KMS. Okay? And there's a KMS server, and it's going to say, oh, am I activated? Do I have a legitimate license? Okay. What you are going to want to do, if you have computers that are not directly connected to the internet, maybe you have a specialized environment, you can use what is known as the VAMT. You're going to use version 3.0. That is the Volume Activation Management Tool, and that way it generates license reports, helps you manage client and server activation. And so just remember, make your plan on how you're going to do that when you're deploying your new infrastructure. Let's talk a little bit more about migration, because I think many of you are going to be thinking about doing this. And when you plan to migrate servers, there are going to be things that you need to think about. Important are going to be the server roles that you're going to want to do. Now, what are the server roles that can migrate from earlier editions of Windows Server to Windows Server 2012? Well, there's a few. Let me write these down for you. The first is going to be Active Directory Federation Services, and that is going to be something that you're going to be doing. Let's see, Hyper-V. Hyper-V is actually another one that can work. The NPS, the Network Policy Server, can also work. Your print and document, obviously, those are pretty basic. I mean, the underlying bones with that have not really changed too much. They've added a few other things. Remote access, again, is going to be something that you can pretty much migrate over really well. And then, of course, Windows updates with WSUS is going to be something that you can also do. And these are going to be, again, you need to make sure that you can migrate these roles, but make sure they are supported Windows Server editions that are going to be able to do that. And you can be using the Windows Server migration tools, which comes with Windows Server 2012. You can look it up on Microsoft, go get to TechNet, and they'll give you those things. Then the next advice that they have for you is going to be dealing with getting your environment migrated over. So when you migrate across domains, or I should say when you're taking your servers across domains, you probably are going to want to choose a brand new forest. And so we say we'll create a brand new Windows Server 2012 Active Directory Directory Services forest, okay? And then what you can do is then you can take the users and then migrate them over. So you create the new forest, you then deploy the applications over onto the new server that is running Server 2012. Then what are you going to do? Well, in order for you to move things, you are going to need to establish a trust. So essentially, you're going to do the Active Directory Domain Services Trust between the current and the new Active Directory service forest. We're going to also want to make sure that you've deployed Exchange, SharePoint, if you have any third-party applications that they're set up, and then begin by migrating over the Active Directory services objects. Those are going to be things like your users, your computers, groups, mailboxes. You're going to be doing that. Then you're going to migrate all your application data and settings for any Microsoft applications, whether it's an Office environment, any corporate custom applications, and then finally, the last but not least is always the third party, right? Because you want to get the foundational stuff set up before you get over to the third party. Then, once you've done that, guess what? It's time to decommission and chop down the old forest. So based on the previous operating system's Active Directory service, you remove that environment so that way there's nothing else left of it. You literally torch the thing, burn it down, and then you are good to go in your new environment. Now, we talked about deployment, we talked about migration, and remember, one of the things that I did talk about with Windows Server 2012 is if you are going into a virtualized environment, remember the Server 2012 Standard Edition has literally only 2 licenses, okay? So it only has 2 licenses for up to 2 processors apiece, but when you do it with the data center, you have the unlimited, okay? And that's pretty much what I think most of you are going to go with, especially if you're going to be using the Hyper-V virtualization in order to get your environment taken from a physical standpoint over to more of a virtualized environment. And that's true whether you're going to go into a cloud environment with Windows Azure or whether you're going to do it on your own physical hosts, your Hyper-V hosts that you're going to have, okay? So some things to think about when you are doing migration and or deploying the new environment. Number one is you want to standardize the virtual machine configuration. When I talk about standardization, remember that means that you're going to want to make sure that you use pretty much the same memory, the processors, think about the storage, networking, what you need to be able to do. You want to plan a lot of memory for Hyper-V hosts because obviously the more memory you have to allocate, then the better your Hyper-V hosts will be because you can give them more memory. Make sure you know how many processors you're going to require, the type that you need. Those are going to all be things that are taken into consideration. So when you do this, you might want to develop a small number of standard virtual machine builds which will help streamline the whole environment. Essentially, if you think about it, you might have a low-end server build, then you have a medium server build, then you've got, I would call it the high-end server build. What's the high-end server build? That bad boy right there, Exchange. Exchange takes a lot of memory and a lot of hard drive space and things like that. So you want to make sure you do that. Whereas a medium server build would be something more like a WAX server or an Office 365 environment, things like that. Or maybe an application server. Your low-end server, that could be anything from maybe a third-party application all the way to something that's very highly specialized, like the KMS server. That's the only thing it does. Or a domain controller that's running certificate services, and that's the only thing it does. Well, that might be a little low-end kind of environment for you. So plan also, when you do this, think about this, make a plan for specific roles on your server, okay? And you should be able to configure most virtual machines with the same disk and operating system configuration, but each virtual machine might vary. So what do you need to do? Take a look at your physical environment first. Monitor your servers before you virtualize it. See what the processor utilization is on it. Look at what your memory utilization is on it, okay? And then when you see that and you're like, oh wow, this one machine has 4 gigabytes, but I notice I'm pegging at about 80% usage on that. Might want to jump it up to 8 when you're doing that. Make sure your virtual configuration matches your physical machine configuration. Because think about this, if your physical machines are doing okay and they're handling the load, then the virtual machine configuration that matches it will also be able to handle the load. That's the basis of what you're doing. So if an application uses a low percentage of the hardware resources, well, guess what? Then you can maybe back down and say, well, hey, even in the physical world, I could use a smaller box, so might as well do that, right? Now, obviously, if your applications are what everybody likes to call business critical, right there, that one right there, Exchange, that goes down, people start squealing like nobody's business. I can't get my email. So you want to make sure that you take care of that. You want to make sure that your business critical applications are on virtual machines that are highly available and very responsive. So make sure that you give them plenty of juice on that, okay? Then you want to make sure that for your business critical applications, and by the way, I notice I've made a little list right here. I've already mentioned one of them right already, and that's the Exchange server. But your Active Directory services, so your domain controllers, think about that. They need to be highly available. They need to be responsive. That's how people log in. That's how people literally get into the network and onto the server, right? If you can't sign on and authenticate because your domain controller is, sucking wind, as we would say here in the States, that's not good. right? You want to make sure that you got that. Also, SQL Server, your databases. Your database servers help everything. True story, I was running my Link environment, and my SQL Server, I'd only given it a little bit of memory, and I should have given it more, and it started choking. Well, guess what? What does Link Server count on for the server store and everything? Your local configuration management, your topologies and everything. Well, if you're running enterprise, your SQL servers, right? And so all of a sudden when my SQL server went down, the machine, literally the virtual machine turned it off, and I was stuck. All of a sudden my little lab demo I was doing, and this was back doing Link 70-337, it just blew up on me right in the middle of doing it. So make sure that you have plenty of stuff available. And when I say stuff, you know what I'm talking about. Physical resources that we would think of, like RAM, storage, virtual I/O coming in for your networking. Make sure that that's all working quite well. So that's the virtualization. Those are the things that we need to think about and have in place when we are doing that migration and deployment for our server infrastructure. It's going to be part of your plan. So what you want to do now is you want to take this and literally create a virtualization plan. So the virtualization plan will go hand in hand with everything else that you're going to do, whether it's the migration of the server roles and the actual software applications. Remember, you need to make sure that your virtualization plan is in place so that way you can have it running and everybody's a happy camper, right? You want the bosses happy, you want your users happy. That's what keeps your job, that's what keeps your life, as I like to say, a little bit nicer when you're dealing with that. So make sure that you plan, and then plan some more. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for joining me.